everyone. I have 7 o'clock on my end here, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our public hearing to talk about hunting regulations. My name is Holly Grant. I'm going to be facilitating the webinar this evening. A few reminders before we get started. Your cameras, microphones, and chat are all going to be disabled during the webinar this evening. If you have questions about any of the proposed regulations, please use that Q&A feature that's going to be located along the bottom of the window in Zoom. We will go through the proposed regulations first and then follow it up with some questions at the end. But please feel free to type in your questions into that Q&A box at any point during the webinar. We are not going to be taking public comment through Zoom. If you would like to provide comment about any of the proposed regulations, you must submit them through the online portal. That link was shown in the PowerPoint presentation before we started here, but you will also receive a link to that portal in an email from Zoom at some point tomorrow. If you need additional contact information, you can find all of that on the Parks and Wildlife website, social media, and also in that follow-up email that you're going to receive from Zoom tomorrow. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Sean to get started.
Good evening, everyone. For the record, my name is Sean Gray, and I'm the Mule Deer and Pronghorn Program Leader for the Wildlife Division. And this evening, I'd like to provide everybody some of our proposed pronghorn regulation changes for the 2021 hunting season. And just give me a sec while I pull up my presentation. Okay, our commission adopted new pronghorn regulations in March of 2013 to allow landowners to determine their own harvest strategy for bucks through an experimental system in the northern panhandle. This was a novel approach when it comes to pronghorn management. As in other areas, we use a limited quota system where permits are issued to landowners, and therefore these regulations were proposed and adopted as a pilot project. In March of 2017, the commission expanded and extended the experimental system for another 4 years because staff believed that more data were needed over a larger area to better examine the impacts of the experiment. PPWD has conducted this pilot project over the last 8 hunting seasons, and staff have monitored populations through annual aerial surveys and mandatory harvest check stations. Staff have also used hunter and landowner opinion surveys to evaluate support for continuing and expanding the experimental system. Since these rules were adopted in 2013, I'd like to provide just a little bit of background on the logic for proposing the experimental system for bucks. Staff reasoned that because herds in the northern panhandle are healthy and have stable reproduction, that a landowner-controlled system for bucks could work in these areas. Such a season could decrease workforce commitments and increase hunter opportunity by allowing landowners to determine their own harvest strategy. Another benefit of the experimental season is that it has allowed landowners and hunters to book hunts earlier in the year, and permits at that time were issued no earlier than mid-August following the annual summer population surveys. Staff believed after the experiment, if data suggested minimal or no decline in pronghorn numbers, sex ratios, average buck age structure, and hunter success, then no negative biological impacts would occur with the landowner-controlled system for bucks. This map demonstrates current pronghorn herd units in the northern panhandle. The herd units in red are where the experimental season was initiated in 2013, and the herd units in blue were added to the experiment in 2017. These experimental herd units were near Dalhart in the northwest panhandle and Pampa in the northeast panhandle. The experimental areas were representative of habitat land ownership pronghorn population parameters, and permit demand and utilization throughout the northern panhandle. In order to effectively monitor and assess hunter behavior and harvest impacts during the pilot project, as well as to facilitate compliance with proof of sex and tagging requirements, the rules required hunters to obtain a department-issued experimental permit. Because the annual person bag limit is one pronghorn, only one experimental permit was issued to each licensed hunter. Staff used mandatory check stations located in Dalhart and Pampa to collect harvest data on the total harvest, age structure, and horn growth of harvested bucks. Hunters were required to present their pronghorn at a check station within 24 hours of harvest. Also, annual population surveys occurred in these herd units to acquire population trend, reproduction, and sex ratio data, which we compare to other similar herd units to help determine effects of the experimental season. The population estimates for the Dalhart experimental area and surrounding herd units are shown in this graph. The gray line shows the population estimate for herd units surrounding the Dalhart experimental area, with the left y-axis depicting pronghorn numbers for this line. The yellow line represents years prior to the experiment, and the purple line signifies years during the experiment, with the right y-axis depicting pronghorn numbers for this line. The trend line for the surrounding herd units in Dalhart experimental area, symbolized by the white lines, have a similar trend. However, in the experimental area, the population declined significantly from 2019 to 2020. Formatted the same as the previous graphs, the population estimates for the Pampa area are shown in this slide. The gray line signifies the population estimate for herd units surrounding the Pampa experimental area, with the left y-axis depicting pronghorn numbers for this line. And the yellow line designates years prior to the experiment, with the purple line representing years during the experiment, with the right y-axis showing pronghorn numbers in the Pampa experimental area. The trend lines for the surrounding herd units and the Pampa experimental area, again symbolized by the white lines, have a slightly different trend, but are both declining. Similar to Dalhart, the population in the Pampa experimental area decreased more severely from 2019 to 2020 compared to the surrounding herd units. Staff use population sex ratios as one guide to harvest intensity. During the experiment, only bucks were harvested, so higher buck harvest rates have the potential to reduce buck numbers within these areas. This higher buck harvest can cause sex ratios to become more skewed toward does. Sex ratios are estimated when staff conduct aerial surveys in June and July of each year. The 2011 and 2013 average sex ratio, represented by the darker bars, was estimated prior to initiating the experiment in the fall of 2013. The lighter bars represent the average sex ratio from 2014 to 2020, 7 years after the start of the experiment. In both experimental areas, the sex ratio has increased with a more drastic rise in the Pampa area. The pH category embodies all other herd units in the northern panhandle not included in the experiment. TPWD determines harvest quotas and issues buck permits for surplus pronghorn in these areas. Therefore, harvest is limited. Because of this system, sex ratios were more stable and natural in these areas during the same time frame as the experiment. Age structure of harvested animals can be another measure of harvest intensity. This graph illustrates the average age of harvested animals in each area, Dalhart and Pampa, as well as other areas in the panhandle symbolized by pH. The dark bars indicate the average age structure of bucks harvested within each area 1 year prior to the experiment. The light bars show the average age of bucks harvested during 8 years of the pilot project. The age structure in both experimental areas is becoming younger, with more severity in Dalhart than Pampa. In addition, the average age structure of harvested bucks in both areas is younger than other areas of the northern panhandle within the same time period. To measure opinions about the experimental season, Staff sent out questionnaires to hunters who participated in the experimental season and landowners in the Northern Panhandle in 2016 and 2020. To gauge support for the experimental season, questionnaires were sent to these constituents. Hunters were identified as those who picked up experimental permits during the 2015 and 2019 hunting seasons, and landowners were anyone who had received pronghorn permits from TPWD in the past that had property in the Northern Panhandle. These questionnaires were sent to 267 hunters in 2016 and 229 hunters in 2020. In 2016, 672 landowners received a questionnaire, with 698 landowners being sent a questionnaire in 2020. Response rates ranged from 42 to 48% for hunters and 64 to 66% for landowners. Hunter satisfaction in the experimental area was high when comparing hunter opinions for both years. However, hunters who were very satisfied or satisfied decreased from 77% in 2016 to 68% in 2020. Over 80% of hunters responded in both years that they support continuing the experimental season concept in the current areas. From 2016 to 2020, hunters that supported expanding the experimental season to new areas in the Northern Panhandle decreased from 83% to 71%, but most still liked the idea. In the 2020 opinion survey, staff also asked hunters if given a choice, would they rather hunt for 9 days under the experimental season concept or go back to TPWD issuing permits to landowners with the 16-day season, which would extend the current season by 1 week. Not a majority, but 48% of hunters like continuing the current 9-day season with the experimental concept. In contrast to hunters, landowner satisfaction within the experimental areas has decreased from 47% in 2016 to 37% in 2020. In addition, more landowners were neutral in 2020 compared to 2016. Landowner support within the experimental area decreased from 65% in 2016 to 57% in 2020 when asked if they would like to continue the experiment in the current areas. When asked, do you support expanding the experimental concept to other areas of the Northern Panhandle? Landowners within the experimental areas showed less support for this idea in 2020 compared to 2016. As with hunters in the 2020 opinion survey, landowners were asked if given a choice, would they rather have a 9-day season with the experimental concept or return to TPWD issuing permits to landowners and extend the current 9-day season to 16 days. The majority of landowners within the experimental area wanted TPWD to issue permits and extend the season to 16 days. Data indicate that the experimental concept seemed to have little to no impact on pronghorn population sustainability. However, the intense buck harvest for 8 hunting seasons has had a negative impact on buck age structure and sex ratios within the experimental areas. With impacts to buck age structure and fewer bucks on the landscape, hunter satisfaction is decreasing, but hunters still like the concept. This is contrasted to landowners whose satisfaction and support for the experimental concept are declining. When given the option, the majority of landowners prefer a 16-day season with TPWD issuing permits and setting quotas over a 9-day season using the experimental concept. Given landowner support for a 16-day season, staff sent out another opinion survey this past November to help determine how the extra week would fit into the current season, as staff have no substantial biological justifications on where this extension should occur, either by extending a week before or after the current season start or end. To evaluate support for extending the season from 9 days to 16 days, staff sent out questionnaires to these constituents. Hunters were identified as those who purchased hunting licenses in 2020 and resided in the Panhandle and Trans-Pecos. Landowners were anyone who applied for pronghorn permits in 2020 statewide. These questionnaires were sent via 2 emails and 1 mailing. For hunters, a total of 5,397 surveys were sent out, with only 502 hunters responding, a 9% response rate. The landowner response rate was much higher at 77%, with 418 landowners responding out of 541. Most hunters who have hunted pronghorn before and landowners preferred a 16-day season versus a 9-day season. More hunters preferred starting the current season a week earlier, while more landowners favored extending the season a week later. Staff have intensively monitored populations and are proposing to cancel the experimental season for bucks in the northern panhandle based upon excessive buck harvest causing younger buck age structure and more skewed sex ratios. In addition, the opinion survey showed that landowner and hunter satisfaction has decreased within the experimental areas, as well as landowner support for continuing in the current areas or expanding the season to new areas. Also, when given a choice, the majority of landowners would rather use a 16-day season with TPWD setting quotas than the 9-day season with the experimental concept. Staff are also proposing to extend the current season from 9 days to 16 days statewide, since staff issues pronghorn permits to set harvest quotas for each property, and that most hunters and landowners in the recent opinion survey liked a 16-day season better than the 9-day season. For the 1-week extension, staff are proposing the season be changed to start the Saturday closest to October 1, which is the current start date, and continue for 16 consecutive days based upon the high response rate and opinions of landowners, since there are no concrete biological reasons on where this extension should occur. And that wraps up my portion of the statewide hunting proclamation changes. We'll turn it over to Sean Oldenberger.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Sean Oldenberger. I'm the Small Game Program Director, as Sean Gray stated. So I am responsible in the Wildlife Division at Texas Parks and Wildlife Department for the oversight of ducks, geese, rabbits, squirrels, quail, chachalacas, wild turkeys. And so I'm going to continue on discussing proposed regulations with regards to changes with upland game birds and migratory game birds. Just for a little background for folks, we did present these proposed changes in January to our commission, and next week we'll go in front of our commission again with regards to these proposed changes for adoption. And then it will be up to the commission to decide if we adopt these proposed changes as is, or if changes do occur. And so just giving you a little background in regard to that. So make sure if you want to comment regarding pronghorn or muzzleloaders or archery, or talking about dogs and leashes, make sure you go to the statewide hunting proclamation, and that section is where you can comment regarding to those. Also with regard to upland game birds, which I'm about ready to present, those things are also in the statewide proclamation. When we talk about doves and geese and ducks, those are in the migratory game bird proclamation. So just make sure when you go to public comment, there's a distinction between those two different proclamations, and that's how we do it legally with regards to our state regulatory process. But however, just want to make sure I directed you to the right section with regards to various regulations that we're talking about tonight. So with that, I'm going to try to get my presentation going here, if I can figure out how to share my screen. Oops. And obviously I can't figure it out. So there we go. All right, once again, my name is Sean Oldenberger. I'm the Small Game Program Director in the Wildlife Division for Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And so, as you can see here, I'm going to talk about proposed changes to the statewide hunting and migratory game proclamations. Hopefully I did a good job explaining where to look for. If you want to comment about pronghorn, you go to the statewide hunting proclamation. If you want to comment about doves, you go to the migratory game bird proclamation. So hopefully that is clear for everyone. Please ask a question in the Q&A if you do have any questions regarding that. I'm going to go over some proposed changes to upland game birds the department is proposing to the commission for adoption next week. And so we're going to talk about probably our most seldom harvested upland game bird in the state. These are chachalacas. It's open. We do have an open season in the lower Rio Grande Valley and a few counties down there. And so this was just something that came up via public comment a couple years ago that we do have disjunct opening days for chachalaca and quail. And the way the current calendars work right now, we basically flip every other year with regards to the opening day. So for instance, we're proposing right now in the current regulation for chachalacas is the Saturday nearest November 1st. We would like to change it to Saturday nearest October 28th. And so that's just going to allow calendar basically alignment regard to quail and chachalaca opening dates. We have very limited harvest. We have very limited hunters that actually go after plain chachalacas down in the Lower Grand Valley. They're at their northern end of their range. These birds do go all the way down into South America as far as they have a very large geographical range, but very limited in the United States, just in those few counties, at least for an open hunting season, just in those few counties in the Lower Rio Grande Valley of Texas. They are found in a few other counties as well, but not in very substantial populations that are not considered huntable. And so when you look at calendars regarding this, and this is just an example, say from 2022 and 23 and 2023 and 24 with regards to this current regulation. So hopefully I don't confuse you with this. So basically underneath the current regulations during the 22 hunting season, we would open chachalacas on October 29th. And then the following year would be November 4th. And so with this proposed change, basically both those calendars would be opening on October 29th, which would be the same weekend that quail season opens across the state. Obviously, there's not many people that are going to be hunting chachalacas and quail at the same time. That opportunity doesn't present itself because they are obviously in different habitats. But this is just for simplicity of regulations that the department is proposing this regulation. And obviously, it won't impact that large number of hunters, but that just makes that we have concurrent openers and simplify regulations for our hunters in Texas. So the next one we're going to be moving to for a proposed change with regards to wild turkeys. The department is proposing to close spring eastern turkey season in Panola County in East Texas. This county has actually met the decision variable for closure the department has done in the past. On average, less than one bird has been harvested over the three past seasons during the spring. And just for a little background for folks know, this is in our mandatory reporting counties. And so you actually, if you do harvest an eastern wild turkey during the season, you are required by law to go and check this bird in online through our website or through the application that we provide and My Texas Hunt and Harvest. And so you can do it both of those ways. And so we do have some fairly good records going back to the physical check stations and then the electronic check stations with regards to hunter harvest data. In Panola County, if we look at a harvest for over the last 20 years, which this graph does show, you can see there in 2001 through about 2004, 2003, you know, and even into the mid 2000s, we were harvesting at least about a dozen birds per year in this county. With regards to this part of Texas, we consider basically our harvest to be linear related to our abundance. For instance, with regards to Panola County in comparison, when you look at our counties along the Red River and specifically Red River County, that's where we get our highest harvest during this season. And that's where we actually have our best habitat and our best populations of birds as well. And so that's where a majority of the harvest occurs during this eastern turkey spring season. And so when we look at Panola County through time, obviously over the last 20 years, this population has declined based on harvest. And even in 2018, 2019, we did not report, there was no reported hunter harvested eastern wild turkeys in this area and in the zone in Panola County. So we're proposing to the department to close this county and reassess in time and think about possible changes in assisting with habitat management on the ground, along with other potential changes that could come along with this closure in Texas by the department. Moving on to another wild proposed change on wild turkeys. We just talked about mandatory reporting harvest in our eastern turkey counties. If you look at the map there provided on the slide, you can see those in kind of a lighter gray in eastern Texas there, mostly along the Red River and down along the Louisiana Texas border. And those are the counties that are currently open with regards to those zone, and that's where mandatory reporting occurs. What the department is proposing to the commission is actually to start mandatory reporting on one gobbler counties. You can see those in a little bit darker gray there in south central Texas. We have support from our wildlife management associations and wildlife cooperatives in these respective counties. Most counties in this recently area have tradition to mandatory reporting for doe days for white-tailed deer. So there is a lot of familiarity now with our landowners and hunters in this area that are hunting with regards to how to report and mandatory report. In those listed counties, we're doing that. Basically, the reason we're doing that is since we have so few hunters and so few turkeys in this area, we get really mixed results when it comes to our small game harvest survey information. The department does send out surveys to approximately 25,000 hunters on an annual basis to try to estimate harvest at a fairly large ecoregion scale, but also try to get down to the county level. And when we look at long-term data reports, in a lot of these counties, we're lucky to actually get a hunter reported harvest on every other year or every 5 years because the populations that aren't that abundant. So that makes it really difficult for the department to make decisions regarding how do we move forward with this hunting season. We are allowed basically a spring only season in these counties. It's one gobbler from April 1st to April 30th. That's on regulation. And so when we talk about whether to move regulations up or down with regards to open or closed seasons, the department really doesn't have enough information to make those decisions at this time. So this is to get better information to be able to manage our resources for citizens of Texas and especially our hunters, and trying to make better sound decisions moving forward with regards to turkeys in this area of Texas. We'll move on to another wild turkey proposal. So this impacts probably more hunters than the previous two proposals, obviously. And so this is just making consistent regulations regard to north and south zones regarding the spring and fall seasons. We did have a commissioner in the past request this, but basically this would be aligning zones along the following fall boundary along Highway 90. If we do have any deer hunters listening in, you probably know this boundary fairly well. And we have disjunct basically counties with regard to north and south and spring and fall. And it has created confusion over the years with regards to this issue. And so we're recommending to actually change this and make it consistent once again, for simplified regulations, but also to follow a little biology that I'll discuss here in a minute. So this is our current fall zones. If you look there in the light green, that is the current north zone. If you look there in yellow, that is the south zone. We do have some special regulations counties in South Texas outlined there in blue, but we'll ignore those for this presentation. And so I'm just talking about the green and south counties. And so talking about moving boundaries with regard to proposed fall zones, we don't really impact that many hunters. Basically, those counties outlined there, Barrett, Gonzales, Wilson, Carnes, and Goliad, those counties would actually be transitioned to the north. And so those would be removed from the south zone. So just a little bit of a change there, but not much. But then most of our changes would actually occur in the current spring zones. So once again, here in the light green is the spring zones, in the yellow is the south zones. And so we'd obviously be shifting those counties you see there in stripes. So there's 26 counties there. So those would be shifting. I believe there's 26 counties there. Those would be shifting to the north zone. And so that would basically redraw that line from north and south. And so obviously there are a fair number of hunters in this county, in these counties listed here. And so what would this do? Basically, with regards to this, those counties, once again, placed in the south zones, it wouldn't impact those that much. But obviously the spring seasons, when we look at those would advance those north counties basically 2 weeks forward with those in green that are currently in green. Actually, that aligns better with our biological information that we've gathered in the past with regards to spring turkeys and their basically how they breed, the breeding phenology in these counties. We like to get hens on the nests before hunting seasons open. A number of research projects have showed that this actually helps sustain the population and make sure those hens are bred and they get on those eggs and incubate those eggs and hopefully have a successful clutch and produce more turkeys. And so this would align with what that nesting chronology we know with regards to research in the past in these counties. And now I'll move on to another one. This is not upland game bird related, but once again, this would be in the statewide hunting proclamation. If you were to comment on this, this is squirrel hunting proposed changes. And so basically right now, the department has 208 counties open to squirrels hunting. Most of those are, we have two zones. We basically have some eastern zones where we do have limited harvest and bag limits. And then we have zones, counties open to the west of that, which are basically open year round with no daily bag limit. And so what we're proposing is to take those 46 closed counties and just open those and add to the regulations in the western 2/3 of Texas, where you'd have year-round seasons and no daily bag limits. So this extends those hunting opportunity in those closed counties, and this is for simplicity. What you can see here is two pictures of Texas in front of you, obviously, and two maps. And so I'll explain this a little bit. The one there on the right is, this is all citizen science data collected through iNaturalist, but that shows basically where fox squirrels are located in the state of Texas through this citizen science work. And so it kind of shows the range of where we find fox squirrels. Obviously, it's not all, there are fox squirrels that do show up where dots are not represented, but this kind of gives you a good idea of the range of them in Texas. On the left, you'll actually see the same thing, but that's gray squirrels. Gray squirrels, if anybody knows, in East Texas, those are predominantly a piney wood species that we see in East Texas, and where those are hunted primarily in that east zone. However, you'll actually notice there are populations of gray squirrels in Lubbock and surrounding areas as well. There's also fox squirrels on the right. You'll see in Amarillo, Odessa, Midland, even branching out into getting close to the Davis Mountains, El Paso area, El Paso County. And so some of those areas are actually in closed counties now. For simplicity, we're going to do away with those closures. And the fact is, most of those squirrel populations historically didn't exist in those areas. We've seen some expansion along riverine habitats across the United States regarding both squirrel populations. And so as those squirrel populations continue to expand, we're just going to expand hunting opportunity, because we don't want to limit hunter opportunity if someone happens to be in a closed county currently and has to have a squirrel population that they would like to take a few on an annual basis. So we don't want to limit. The department is proposing to the commission to do away with those 46 closed counties. So once again, basically for simplicity, and to add a limited amount of increased harvest, but in certain areas that can be substantial, especially for a certain landowner. And here what you see in front of you is how many squirrels we harvest on an annual basis. Obviously, most of them happen in the piney woods during that limited hunting season that opens in the fall, runs basically, has a May season as well, but closes in the winter as well. And so you'll see there actually in the Post Oak Savanna and a few other places, Edwards Plateaus, we do harvest substantial amounts of squirrels on an annual basis. We do even get some into the Rolling Plains and other places. And so obviously a squirrel harvest is occurring in some of these locations and some of the adjacent counties where closures do occur. And so once again, we simplify regulations and allow a little bit more hunter harvest opportunity for certain landowners that do have squirrel populations. I'm going to be moving next on to the 21-22 Migratory Game Bird Proclamations. And so if you'd like to comment on this, make sure you go to that site that Holly had up earlier and go to the Migratory Game Bird Proclamation. I'm not going to go into an extensive information here, because basically we have no federal framework changes. What that means is Fish and Wildlife Service is not requiring any changes by the states with regards to daily bag limits or season length. So those are maintained from this last hunting season. And so the department is proposing to the commission just calendar progression for season dates for all migratory game bird seasons. So that's, once again, really simplistic. We do have an exception to this, and I'll go over the proposed change the department is bringing forward next week to the commission. And so basically we requested from the Fish and Wildlife Service 2 extra days during the special white-winged dove days in the South Zone. See the map there of the zones in Texas regards to doves there in South, basically below Houston, San Antonio, and Del Rio. You'll see the South Zone. That's where you can hunt during that special season right now. So we requested the Fish and Wildlife Service, because all migratory game bird seasons have to be approved basically by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. They dictate the season lengths and daily bag limits, when we can start seasons, when we can end seasons. The department does not have that latitude, nor does the commission. We have to be, we cannot be more liberal than the Fish and Wildlife Service federal frameworks. We can be more restrictive, but we can't be more liberal. So we have to abide by the rules of the road put forward us by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And so we're proposing to add 2 more days to that special season, to go from 4 days to 6 days. And the reason we're doing this is because obviously if anybody's dove hunted for a lengthy amount of time in Texas, you know white-winged dove populations have increased substantially. They used to be just concentrated in lower Rio Grande Valley. If you go back 40 to 45 years ago, have steadily increased across the state, even into the piney woods, all the way. They're actually moving farther north in Texas into Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. We're seeing breeding populations throughout the country where they didn't exist prior. And so what you see in front of you is a graph with estimated harvest on the special white-winged dove area in the South Zone. That South Zone has obviously expanded a couple times in the last 7 or 8 years as well, geographically, and now encompasses all the South Zone. And so we've gone basically from the mid 90s or late 90s, where we're harvesting less than 100,000 white wings during this special season, to during 2019, we harvested or estimated over 500,000 white-winged doves taken during this special season. So once again, this is a special season the Fish and Wildlife Service allows us to have just for a white-winged dove harvest. We do have regulations. In fact, if by the Fish and Wildlife Service, it actually reduces our daily bag limit on mourning doves to 2 during this special season. The Texas Parks and Wildlife cannot change that regulation unless we had approval from the Fish and Wildlife Service. So thankfully, we have approval from the Fish and Wildlife Service due to the expansion of white-winged doves across the landscape. There's less a biological concern with regards to take on white-winged doves across the range due to that growth and population growth. And so moving on to the calendars, you can see there in September in the gold, and I should say that gold September 3rd and 10th of this next hunting season is where we would propose to put those 2 extra days. The traditional hunting days would once again be on the 4th, 5th, 11th, and 12th. That's where we've kind of put those days, and we've had that latitude to put those days. And then the regular season can't open any sooner by Fish and Wildlife Service rules than September 14th. So you'll see there on September 14th, that Tuesday in gray is when the regular season would open, and you're allowed to take 15 of either or a combination of white-winged doves and mourning doves. And so once again, we're proposing to have basically 2-3 day seasons with this special season in the South Zone. And this is going forward to the Commission for adoption next week. With regards to any other migratory game bird hunting seasons, once again, if you have questions regarding those, make sure you put those in the Q&A that Holly outlined earlier, or go on to public comment and put your information down there. But this is the only proposed change the department is making to migratory game bird seasons for next hunting season if approved by the Commission. So that concludes my presentation. I know that was a lot of stuff, so please make sure you put stuff in the Q&A if you have it. And then I'll turn it over to Alan Kane, who's our white-tailed deer coordinator, who's going to talk about a few more things with regards to the statewide hunting proclamation. So thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Sean. Good evening, everyone. My name's Alan Kane. I'm the white-tailed deer program leader. And this evening, I'll be reviewing several proposals to the statewide big game harvest regulations. And so let me see if I can get my presentation up right quick. All right. The first change that's being proposed is, quite frankly, just a minor housekeeping change to include crossbows in the definition of lawful archery equipment. The current definition of lawful archery equipment includes compound bows, longbows, and recurve bows. However, in the archery section under lawful means in Chapter 6511 of the Texas Administrative Code, the regulation refers to lawful archery equipment and crossbows rather than a single reference to all legal archery equipment. This was an artifact left over from a time when crossbows were added as lawful means of take during archery season, but never included in the definition of archery equipment. So in order to simplify regulations and provide clarity as it relates to all lawful archery equipment, staff are proposing to include crossbows in the definition of lawful archery equipment. And I just do want to clarify, we've been having some public comments on the website, and folks are thinking that we're going to allow crossbows. And just to clarify, crossbows are currently legal as a means of take during the archery season. So this proposal is just cleaning up some regulation language, the definition. So the next change being proposed is a modification of the definition of a muzzleloader. Again, under the current definition in Chapter 65 of the Administrative Code defines a muzzleloader as any firearm loaded through the muzzle. The definition is a bit ambiguous on what must be loaded through the muzzle, whether that's only the bullet or projectile, or does it require the powder be loaded through the muzzle as well. This lack of clarity in the regulation leads to questions by hunters and others as what is considered legal in terms of what a muzzleloader is, especially with changes and enhancements to the muzzleloader technology that we've seen come online in the last several years. Therefore, staff are proposing to amend the definition to clarify that the bullet or projectile can only be loaded through the muzzle. Amending the definition would remove any uncertainty for hunters and firearm manufacturers as to what is legal and what is not legal in Texas with regards to muzzleloaders. This proposal in part was prompted by a request from Federal Premium, the firearms company, earlier this summer when they were inquiring about the use of their new muzzleloading system. It's called a Fire Stick, and the Associated Traditions muzzleloader that uses that Fire Stick technology. And since that request from Federal Premium, we've also had a request from a number of hunters asking about the use of Fire Stick system in Texas and whether it would be considered a legal muzzleloader. And for those individuals that may be unfamiliar with this new technology for muzzleloaders, I just wanted to provide a brief explanation of what this is. This new Fire Stick technology uses a polymer-coated capsule to enclose the powder, which is essentially a pre-measured self-contained powder charge, as you see on the screen right there. This technology allows for loading of the powder charge into the breech, as illustrated in the photo, and then the primer is placed in the end of that capsule. And then the bullet or projectile must still be loaded through the muzzle, as it is with any other muzzleloader, and it's seated against a shelf that's in the barrel, as illustrated in the photo there on the bottom. And then that Fire Stick or that polymer powder capsule, the dimensions in the shelf and the barrel of the firearm prevent the use of centerfire shotgun cartridges. Additionally, the muzzleloading rifles or this Traditions muzzleloader that uses the Fire Stick technology features a recessed firing pin designed to only strike a fire stick, not any centerfire or shotgun cartridge, whether it's accidentally or intentionally inserted into that particular firearm. So after review of this technology, staff believe this meets the standard for muzzleloaders, but clarification is necessary to remove any uncertainty as to the legality of such technology. Moving on, the next change being proposed involves the trailing of wounded deer with dogs in 10 East Texas counties. Just to give a little history, in 1990, the commission adopted rules prohibiting the use of dogs to trail wounded deer in 34 East Texas counties. So it'd be all those in green at that time. That change was necessary because dogs were being used to unlawfully hunt deer, which was causing the depletion of the resource. And in the 1980s and early 90s, dog hunting culture was very pervasive in this part of East Texas. And so by 2000, the department had determined that the practice of using dogs to hunt deer had declined to a point of being essentially non-existent in those counties, and it actually removed the prohibition in 10 of those counties, those in pink. And then in 2005, lifted the ban in Washington and Hunt County, these in blue. And then in 2013, removed the prohibition in 12 additional counties, those in purple, since dog hunting in East Texas is no longer problematic or a widespread issue. And much of that dog hunting culture that was prevalent in the 80s and 90s is largely gone, by 2010 or so. And so we don't hardly hear about that anymore. And it just, at the time, it lifted a prohibition on those 10 counties in green. And so over the last several years, staff continued to receive requests to allow the use of dogs to recover wounded deer in these counties. And after further review, staff no longer consider illegal dog hunting to be an issue or resource concern. in the last 10 years, we've only had 3 incidences statewide with a total of 8 charges for hunting deer with dogs. And only one of those incidences occurred in San Augustine County, in one of the counties in yellow there. And that was actually back in 2011, and it resulted in 1 conviction. But essentially, there's been no cases, no dog hunting that we're aware of or law enforcement division is aware of in those particular counties. So staff, along with those requests from the public in those counties, staff believe it would be appropriate to propose removing the prohibition on trailing wounded deer with dogs in these 10 remaining counties. Therefore, staff are proposing to completely remove the prohibition in 6 of those counties, those in green, which include Angelina, Hardin, Nacogdoches, Orange, Shelby, and Tyler counties. And in those 4 remaining counties in yellow, which include Jasper, Newton, Sabine, and San Augustine, we'd propose allow the trailing of wounded deer with no more than 2 dogs on the leash. Now, staff believe that prohibition in all 10 counties could be lifted, but we have received a few comments from hunters and landowners in these 4 counties to limit the trailing of wounded deer to no more than 2 dogs on a leash. And they're just out of concern for potential resurgence of dog hunting in those 4 counties in yellow. Don't think that's going to be an issue, but nonetheless, there is some concern by a few individuals in those counties. And to address some of this public concern, staff believe the best approach would be to make a gradual change in the remaining 4 counties by allowing dogs to track wounded deer, but do so on a leash where the dog handler is in control, and then come back a few years from now and revisit the complete removal of prohibition in those counties. So that concludes my presentation, and I'll turn it back over to Holly.
Yeah, hey everyone. We don't have any questions right now in the Q&A. So if you have any questions before we wrap up here, make sure you go ahead and use that function. You should see like 2 conversation bubbles with Q&A under it at the bottom of your screen in Zoom. We will hang out here for a little bit just to see if anything comes through. So remember, any questions that you have should go into that Q&A box. Any comments that you have about anything that we heard this evening should go through our online portal, which you'll get links to in your email tomorrow. So I see a question that I can answer really quick because it looks like we're losing a few people. There's a question about if the recording is going to be available to view, and it will be. It'll be posted onto our Parks and Wildlife Facebook page and on one of our YouTube pages, I believe, as well. So keep an eye out on our Texas Parks and Wildlife Department Facebook page for a link to the recording. I forgot to mention that earlier, that if you missed anything, you'll be able to see the whole thing tomorrow.
Hey, Holly, we have a question from Neil on there. He said, are there less white-winged hunters or just more birds? Actually, the last 2 years during the special white-winged dove area, we've actually had more hunters and more birds harvested than ever. And so we have more interest in this special season, and just for the fact that we have more birds than in the last few years than we've ever had, even in South Texas, where historically we've had white-winged doves. So both the popularity is growing and the population is growing. So those are both good things.
Looks like we have another question about dogs in why doesn't Texas allow dogs to hunt deer for at least a 2-week season? And again, in Texas, dog hunting was a resource concern, so it was impacting those deer populations in East Texas, and so that would be a concern if we went back to that dog hunting. Allowed a dog hunting season over there, and those populations are fairly sensitive with pretty high hunter density in East Texas. And so aside from just the potential for impact to deer population of that resource, today's world, there's just lots of concern about trespass. I mean, that was a few of the comments we've been receiving from folks about concerns with this, or dogs running across property lines and chasing deer where they shouldn't be. And so, but the biggest concern would be impact to that resource if dog hunting were to return.
We don't have any other questions lined up in our queue. I'm going to give it maybe another minute or two just to make sure that we had a chance to answer anything that you guys might have for us.
Holly, it also should be noted that this presentation is actually going to be available on Facebook, our Facebook page, as well as be posted to our YouTube page as well. So if you happen to have friends or family members that missed this, by all means, as Holly stated earlier, they're going to be able to go back and watch it, and then hopefully have public comment. They can do that after they have a chance to actually review the proposed changes we have to the commission coming next week.
Looks like there's another question about the dogs just following up to what I was answering. How does it impact the deer population? You abide by the limit allowed. It's a good point. One of the other issues over there is that we have antler restrictions in those counties, and it's difficult to be able to judge a buck running across there, whether it's a buck or a doe in those counties. And we have doe day seasons over there, and so there's potential for issues with harvest of animals that are not intended to be harvested in particular parts of that season. So that's an issue.
We also have a question about daily bag limits in regard to the special white-winged dove area in the dove season. That's a great question, and I actually probably breezed over that way too fast. And so we do have differential daily bag limits with regards to the regular season in the South Zone and the special season. So the special season is just for white-winged dove harvest. And so that's why when you look at the daily bag limits, you're still allowed 15 birds in the bag like you are in the regular season. But the difference is there during that special white-winged dove season, you're only allowed 2 mourning doves in your daily bag limit, or you're also allowed 2 white-tipped doves in your daily bag limit. But the reduction for mourning doves during that special season is because it is a special season that's only allowed by Fish and Wildlife Service for harvesting white-winged doves. Compared to the regular season that is proposed to open September 14th, if you remember those calendars, you can actually harvest up to 15 birds in your daily bag limit, but that can be a combination or wholly white-winged doves or wholly mourning doves, or basically an aggregate or a combination of those 2 species, up to 15. And so those daily bag limits are much different between the special season and the regular season. I also should note there's actually a difference in shooting hours during those seasons as well. Basically, it's an afternoon only season as proposed from noon to sunset with regards to the special season. Whereas during the regular season, 30 minutes prior to sunset is basically your time period when you can hunt. And so there are restrictions when you can hunt as well during the special season as far as time of day. So please make sure to check those regulations before you go hunting during the special season, because daily bag limit and shooting times are different between the special season and the regular season.
Yeah, and it looks like we are caught up again with these questions. So we'll give it maybe another minute or two again.
So there's a question that says, will all this be updated in this year's printed outdoor annual? Well, good news is we're going to have a printed outdoor annual this year that is in the works. And also, yes, if these changes are adopted by the commission, because that is the reality, is the department proposes changes, the commission actually adopts the hunting and fishing regulations on an annual basis. So if they adopt the proposed changes we went through tonight, those will be in the outdoor annual this year.
And again, we're caught up, so we'll just hang out here for a little bit. While we're possibly waiting for additional questions to come in, I do just want to say again, thank you guys so much for joining us here this evening. We mentioned this already, but if you missed any part of the webinar, it will be posted online on our social media tomorrow. And if you have any questions that we didn't answer this evening, you can email those. There's going to be a contact email and the link to the portal that'll be sent through Zoom in an email tomorrow. So just please utilize that. And you'll be able to submit your comments online through March 24th. I think it's 5 p.m. March 24th. And I'm not seeing anything else in the Q&A. So I think we'll just go ahead and wrap it up here. Thank you guys all again so much for your time this evening. We really appreciate it.